standing on the, this isn't really the corner of 33rd and Main. And so I planted myself here because this is where we're going to start the tour, talking about the hospital or the medical center, and a little bit about the Carter Park area. And we've been researching this for quite some time. This is a new tour for the museum, and Brad's taking the day off. So he's leaving it up to the volunteer to do this. But anyway, I've done a lot of research, and the hospital here on the corner, or the medical center, was originally built in 1929. The folks of Vancouver felt like they needed another hospital besides St. Joseph's, which is down by the Academy. And then there was a Clark County the Clark County Hospital, which is over on T Street and 4th Plain. The building is still there. I don't know what it's used for, but it's still there. And so in 1929, the medical community decided to build this hospital way on the north end of town. And, but they needed money to build this, so they were selling bonds. They needed $75,000 to fund this, and they were coming up short. So they went to the Central Labor Council here in Vancouver. By the way, we opened up our labor exhibit last night. Fantastic exhibit. But anyway, so they went to the Central Labor Council and they said, we need help funding the hospital. The Central Labor Council and its affiliated unions came up with $46,000 to help fund the original hospital. And as a result, they were given 8 of the 15 board member seats on the hospital board. So it was a win-win situation for the entire community. The original vice president of the hospital was Dr. Robert Wiswall. Now, we talked about Dr. Wiswall in one of our earlier tours. He had a house on Block 10. Remember Block 10, that empty lot down there? He was the first doctor in town to have a car, and that was 1908. And so we'll talk more about the cars and the horses, and this neighborhood we're going to be looking at is, a lot of it was platted in the early part of the century, but most of the homes we're going to be looking at are in the 30s and 40s. We'll have some in the teens, but most are going to be actually 20s, 30s, and 40s. So this was Vancouver moving north. So we're going to move on down to the Dr. Frank Boersma house. A lot of people have questions about that. So let's just stay on this side of the street and walk down to Washington Street. This was the Clark General Hospital.
That's what it said.
Yeah. And later it was changed in 45. In 1945, the name was changed to Vancouver Memorial.
That's the one I remember. But yeah, okay. I thought it was Memorial.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it was at the end of World War II, and they wanted to honor the veterans of World War II, so they changed the name. On this corner stands the residence. The original resident was Dr. Frank Boersma. He was a physician. He had his home in this house, and he had his office in this house. And as we walked past the 2-car garage, there was an entrance on 33rd. I believe that was his residence. And here we have the residence, or the entrance on Washington Street. And that was where the people came in to his clinic. This house was built in 1947. The architect was Don Stewart. And you heard Brad talk in previous walks about Don Stewart. He did a lot of commercial buildings, but he also did a lot of residential buildings and residential remodels. A little later, we'll see another one of his houses. I want you to look over here toward the west, toward the southwest. I don't know if you see anything unique about this neighborhood here. This is called the Orchard Heights division or subdivision. Anybody see anything unusual about that?
Lined with trees.
Yeah, it's got all these old growth fir trees. In the Orchard Heights addition, when they put this together, it's from Washington Street down to Franklin. It's from 33rd to the alley between 31st and 32nd. All the old growth fir trees remained. I can only assume that that was the condition of building in this area. Now we're going to turn south. We're going to go along Washington Street down to 29th. And remember I was talking about the horses and the cars. Well, we're going to see a lot of sidewalks that were poured in 1912 and 1913. And you want to keep an eye out for the steel rings that are in the curbs. And I think we all know what those are for. Another thing we'll see on the old curbs, we'll see a steel protection around the curb, because when a horse is pulling a wagon, the wagon doesn't necessarily follow the horse when it makes a turn. It goes right over the corner of the curb. And so to keep the curbs from breaking down, they had the steel rings. So we'll just move down this way. Okay, across the street you see a park, and there is some disagreement as to how the park got its name. I've done quite a bit of research on this, and I believe what I'm telling you is very accurate. For years, this was called Capitol Hill Park. There are 6 lots. It was deeded to the city by Walter Carter. Walter Carter was one of the partners in the CC store. Some of you folks might remember the CC store downtown, or if you went on the Lower Main tour, you saw the CC store, a tan brick building with green awnings. Well, Walter and Sally, his sister Sally, owned the CC store. In the, I believe it was about 1930, Walter dedicated this land to be used as a children's park. Now we're going to go by Walter's house. It's a Spanish eclectic up on 36th Street. It's a beautiful home. Unfortunately, it's surrounded by a laurel hedge, so it makes it difficult to see. This was called Capitol Hill Park until the mid-50s, and the Vancouver City Council changed the name to Carter Park in honor of Walter Carter. So we'll continue on down Washington. Here you can see examples of the steel rings that are in the curb. And you'll find these all over the Carter Park neighborhood. We saw some as well in Esther Short. Hey, one street up, we're on Washington Street right now. And for those of you who've been around Vancouver, you know that the way the city is divided up here on the west side is Division, Washington, Columbia, Daniels, alphabetically. The streets weren't always named that. Originally, when these streets were this area was first platted, Daniels was called Sheridan Street. Columbia was called Tyler. Washington was Moore. 32nd was Winston. 33rd was Cabell. And Division was Rowley. Now you notice in this part of town that the names of the streets are right in the concrete. The names of these streets on the west side were changed by Glenn Rank, an early leader in the community. And he named Columbia after the river. He named Daniels after W. Byron Daniels. He named Franklin after the great statesman. Named Grant after the general. The next street up, it's kind of interesting. There's a 3-block section, and in the concrete it says Rowley Street. It's actually Division, but the name was changed. But when they poured all these curbs, Rowley, he was a well-known real estate magnate in the early part of the century. He developed many plats coming up the west side, and of course that street is named after him. Well, again, the city council changed that name to Division. Main Street divides east and west to a point, but when you hit 4th Plain, Main Street starts to take off at an angle. So Division becomes a dividing line between east and west when you get north of 4th Plain. This building right here, this was a grocery store originally. It was a P.D. Foss. In the 30s, it was a P.D. Foss grocery store. Their entrance is on Washington Street, but when it was a grocery store, the entrance was here on 30th Street. in the early 30s, there were, between Main Street, Kaufman, between 4th Plain and 39th, there were 10 neighborhood grocery stores. And so everybody walked to the store to get their groceries. Down this street at 30th and Franklin was another grocery store. It's an empty lot now. It was called Kensington Park Grocery. And so it was just, what, 5 blocks away. Up here on 30, I believe 31st in Columbia, was another grocery store. It was the Morris store, but much later, I can remember it as Bauman's grocery store. People are trying to sell it now, and they called it, they said it was called the Carter Park store. I can't find any record of it ever being called the Carter Park store. Speaking of Carter Park, I know some of you have seen other versions about how the park was named. So there is a little conflict there. There are those who believe it was named after a jeweler downtown by the name of Carter, who was on the city council. Everything that I have read indicates to me it's much more likely that it's named after Walter Carter. So we'll continue on down to 29th Street. Here on the corner is the Donovan residence. Now, earlier on in our tours, we talked about how important the lumber or the timber industry was to the early years of Vancouver. One of the major mills was the Dubois mills. There was a couple of mills. There was the Dubois mills that he owned outright, and then there was the Dubois Matlack mill. Ray Matlack lived 1 block south of here. We're not going to go by the house, but it's right on the corner here. It's a beautiful home. He moved in there in 1919. But he was a partner in one of the mills. This was the home of J.J. Donovan. Now, Donovan was the secretary of, in other words, he was an officer in the Dubois Company. We're going to go up 29th, and then we're going to backtrack again, because I think there's some really great homes to see. Across the street, this was the home of Louis Schaefer, and he was a partner in the Schaefer McMaster law firm. There's a house down on 4th Plain called the McMaster home. So there's a connection there as well. This home was constructed in 1928. It's called the Colonial Revival. Most of the houses you're going to see on 29th Street are called Colonial Revival. Realtors often refer to 29th Street as Doctor's Row. I've done a lot of research in the city directories over the years, and I can't find that there was ever a doctor that lived on 29th.
Maybe he wanted it.
On 28th, I found homes of a couple doctors. One of them was Dr. Ralph Leeser, and I have a list of some of the significant homes on 28th. But in interest of time, we won't look at those, but those are some that you may want to, on your own, look at. So we're going to turn up the street here. This red house here in the 30s was a home of a fellow by the name of J.T. Urquhart, and he was the manager of Eichenlaub's men's store downtown. So you can see it's mostly, you know, the management folks, the owners of businesses that lived along this street. This home was built in 1923. Again, it's a colonial revival. And it was a home of Fred Sinn. Now, you're going to hear me talk about his partner, Austin Curtin, in a little while. But Fred Sinn was a partner in the C&S meat market downtown. For some reason, the folks that were in the meat market business, they did very well back in that time frame. As I said on an earlier tour, the city council had passed a law that no business could be open on Sunday except for meat markets. They could stay open until 9 a.m. This home was built in 1918, another colonial revival, and it was a home of David Crockett, and he was the president of Vancouver Plywood. And most people have heard of the fellow that lived here. This Dutch colonial home was the home of Herbert J. Campbell. He was the editor and publisher of the Vancouver Columbian from from 1921 until 1941. He died in 1941. But this was built in 1918. This is a craftsman style home. It's older than these others down the street. This was the home of Henry Crass. It's still called the Crass Building. And Henry Crass was a partner in the law firm Crass and Harden. And they were very instrumental in forming the Port of Vancouver district in 1912. So he was an important part of our early years. We're going to turn around and head straight back on 29th Street, and we'll stop on the other side of Washington. Okay, this is a classic colonial revival, again, much like the houses of that era. This house was the home of Mary Elizabeth Schofield. Now, when you were on the walks downtown, remember the Schofield buildings? And there are a number of Schofield buildings around town. This is a family that was very rich in real estate. But she was a widow of Edward Schofield, and but she lived here for many years, and she died in 1954. So she lived here until 1954. Okay, we'll keep moving down to the corner of Columbia and 29th. Okay, this white brick home here was the home of Kinsley Dubois, another member of the Dubois family. He had a car dealership. This home happened to be built in 1938, but all the Dubois are very, very successful in business. And obviously, they lived in close proximity to each other, because the next house is the last home of George Dubois. Remember we talked about George Dubois in one of the earlier tours? He owned the lumber. He was the lumber magnate. His brother Lloyd was the newspaper publisher. And of course Kinsley, he had the car dealership. So they were in a lot of different businesses. So as we go past this home here, the next home, this is George Dubois, his final home. And then we're going to turn right and go up Columbia. I just want to point out that George Dubois' house was built in 1937. So you can see all the houses we've seen so far are from, about 1915 to, this is the newest one we've seen so far, 1937. There have been grocery stores, neighborhood grocery stores in this building since the 30s. Changed names over the years. One of the early owners was a fellow by the name of Morris. Through the 60s and 70s, the Ballman family lived here and worked here. There's a residence attached. Much like a lot of the early grocery stores around Vancouver, the residents were often next door or even attached. And it hasn't been they had a fire here some time ago. It hasn't been a grocery store in some time. But this is the one where, if you read the brochure here, it says it was called Carter Park Grocery. Well, I've never found any indication, looking through the city directories, that it was ever called that. It'd be nice, it's a nice name, but I'm not sure. And if somebody can point me in the right direction, I'll change that story. But looking through the city directories, I found a number of names, and again, it's one of the 10 grocery stores that were in the area. We're going to proceed this way to Daniels. Everybody. The home here on the corner, another colonial revival. This beautiful home was for many years the home of Morris Wolfe. And Wolfe had a number, throughout most of the 20th century, Wolfe had a number of retail stores in industrial supplies, auto supplies, radio, electronics, home furnishings. They moved up Main Street. For many years, they were at the corner of Broadway and 4th Plain, where Walgreens is. And then they built a new store out across SR 500 from the mall. And they weren't there very long before they folded up shop. When we went on our Esther Short tour, we walked past the Wolf Supply building. Remember, I talked about that being the first tilt-up structure in the city of Vancouver. And anyway, this home was for a long time the home of Morris Wolfe and his family. Across the street, his comptroller The Gates family lived right across the street. So we're going to move on up Daniels. To me, Daniels is one of the most beautiful streets in the city. I like to walk from 39th down to the park, and I think you see some beautiful neighborhoods. You're probably wondering why I'm stopping here, but I've got an anecdotal story to tell you. Okay, one block up, we're going to look at some, as we go up, about every block there'll be some notable businessman. But I want to point out the greenhouse over here, the Tudor Revival. If the walls could talk on that house, they'd have a lot of stories to tell you. That's where I lived when I was in high school. You know, another well-known family in the Vancouver area is the Hanna family. We know about the Dick Hanna dealerships. Next year we're going to be doing a Shumway neighborhood tour. And we'll be going by the Eugene Hanna's home on 28th and F Street. Beautiful home that's been completely rebuilt. And he was a banker. His son was William Hanna. Now William Hanna started the auto dealerships. He bought Lynham Studebaker down on Lower Washington Street and later added Jeep to his line. And this was his home. This house was built in the late 40s, and it's part of an addition here, a Sunset View addition. There's several blocks in here that the requirement for building homes was that they be built of brick. Can you guess what family owned this property? The Hidden family, you got it. Here you get a better view of the Sunset View addition and all the brick homes. Most of these houses were built in the 50s, some even into the 60s. We're going to go one block north and see some significant homes up here. Yeah. This beautiful home here, this Spanish eclectic, is hidden by this hedge. But for many years, you could see this beautiful home. It's on two lots. It was the home of Walter Carter. You heard me talk about Walter Carter, Carter Park, the CC store. And he built this house in 1923. He died about 1940, and his widow Bertha ended up relocating to a very small house over on F Street. And we'll see that next year on the Shumway tour. But it's just a gorgeous home. The tax value of this home is probably higher than any other home in the west side of Vancouver. Across the street is another Spanish eclectic. And that was the home of Austin Curtin. Remember, I was talking about CNS Meat Market downtown, and we saw his partner's house down on 29th Street. Well, this is his house. A beautiful home, and these two stand out as two of the most beautiful homes in the west side of Vancouver. This home, I believe, was built in 1937. This was the home of Paul Geiser. Paul Geiser was a superintendent of Vancouver schools for a great deal of time, clear up until about 1955. He was superintendent during the war years when the Vancouver School District grew from 3,000 students to about 14,000 students in just a couple of years. At the same time, he was the president of Clark College. So he wore a lot of hats. And anyway, this modest home is his home. Some people describe it as colonial revival. Some describe it as Cape Cod. It's a fairly large Cape Cod if it is. But anyway, beautiful home, but this is where Paul Geiser lived. You know where you've heard of Geiser Middle School on 99th Street? That was named after him as well.
The house.
Okay. So you're ready for this group?
See, the house is for sale, actually. And we just had a showing this morning, so it's actually clean.
Isn't this fun?
Yeah. Oh, I love the the residential tours, but this guy was really, I mean, can you imagine handling a district where you go from 3,000 to 14,000, which meant in effect that he had 4 times as many employees by the time.
That's right.
That's quite a treat to get to go inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't expect that.
No. Well, when I started putting this tour together initially, I didn't even include this house, and I found out by accident that this was Paul Geiser's house. Okay, we're going to move up to the corner, and we're going to stop at this next corner. So, kitty corner from us is the home, or was the home, of Jacob Propstra. Now, Propstra, he was the manager of Vancouver Creamery. Later, he opened his own creamery called the Holland Creamery. And he had the Holland restaurants. His son, George, started the Burgerville chain. And now it's carried on by George's son-in-law, Tom Mears. George had two sons. Ken, I think, was one of the sons. He died of cancer in his early 20s. And then Don, who I went to school with, is a mental health counselor in San Francisco. And but the family has done a lot for Vancouver. His son George married. If you went on the Esther Short tour, we saw the Kettenring home. And Kettenring owned a lumber mill, and he's a very wealthy man. He had a daughter named Margaret. Well, George married Margaret, so money attracts money, I guess. But anyway, that's Jacob's house, and I don't think they're going to let us in. So the house right across the street, interesting enough, I've tried to find the homes of doctors around the west side, and this was the home of Dr. James Darby. That home was built in 1916. We're going to head back to the park, and we have one more home to see, and then our tour is concluded. This is actually the last stop. I kind of added it at the last moment, but if you've been downtown around Esther Short Park, you go beyond the hotel there, there's a building called the Weber Building. It's an office building, but it used to be a machine shop. And Harry Weber, the owner of that machine shop, he had some fantastic craftspeople working for him. My stepfather was the manager of the Goody potato chip plant on 4th Street. And anytime they needed some oddball thing made, Harry Weber could do it. Didn't matter what it was, Harry could build it. This was Harry's house right here on the corner. And I only point that out because I have some personal history with him. But great guy, great machinist, and a great businessman, a great addition to the city of Vancouver. That concludes our tour. You can find your way back, I hope. We're on 33rd Street. We're not on 33rd in Maine, we're on 33rd in Columbia. So anyway. Okay.